Okay, so we'll just give it another minute to make sure people have time to arrive. All right. Kia ora, koutou ko Anjumrahman tōku ingoa. Welcome to the session today, which is based around the Broadcasting Standards Authority's report, Freedom of Expression and Harms to Diverse Communities, which was published last month. I'd like to begin first with the karakia. Kia hora te marino kia whakapapa pounamu te moana, hei huarahi mā tātou I te rangi nei, aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou ia tātou katoa, hui e, tae ki e. Which translates to, may peace be widespread, may the sea be like greenstone, a pathway for us all this day. Let us show respect for each other, for one another, bind us all together. Today, we will have a presentation on the report from Stacey Woods, who's the Chief Executive of the BSA, and a response from members of the Tāhono Media group. Tāhono Media was a group that was established at the beginning of 2022 and came out of a series of conversations on belonging held with a very diverse range of communities in 2020. Many people were telling us that the way their community was represented in the media was harmful to their sense of belonging. Inclusive Aotearoa Collective Tāhono brought together a group of people to start working together on possible solutions. In 2022, Tāhono Media ran a series of focus groups with a range of communities, and they talked about both positive and negative media reporting. They gave us some examples of how media reporting was harmful, and I'm going to just give a couple of quotes from those conversations. Last year, there was an outbreak of COVID in a Samoan church. It was not necessary to mention an ethnicity and a religion when it had no relevance. And they talked about how the way that was talked about was very different to how outbreaks in other communities had been covered. Another example was related to the Johnny Depp divorce, and the person talked about the headline being bye, which is BYE, then BI. Her sexuality was central to why the media believes the relationship has broken down, and it fostered the idea that bisexuals are promiscuous, cheaters, untrustworthy. From our older persons, they talked about their representation being pretty much two pictures, one of a retired family and happy, or secondly, the deficiency model, where older age is shown as having no hope. And these were both extremes, and there was really not much in the middle. Since then, Tāhono Media has also worked with staff, presenting a panel at their Te Matarau Hui last year, and worked with academics to produce a literature review, which I'll mention towards the end. So I'm now going to move to introducing our speakers for today. Chief Executive Stacey Wood joined the Broadcasting Standards Authority in September 2022. Stacey studied law and English at Otago University and journalism at Massey University in Wellington. She worked as a reporter for the Dominion Post for several years before joining the legal profession, first in intellectual property law before going in-house. Before joining the BSA, Stacey was a general manager at Te Ao Rangahau Engineering New Zealand, overseeing the organisation's legal, policy, public affairs and governance functions. Koro Vaka'uta has connections to the Pacific Islands of Tonga through his father and Te Raroa in the far north through his mother. He worked in the media industry for close to 20 years, most recently as editor of Radio New Zealand Pacific, before moving to the Human Rights Commission, Te Kāhui Tika Tangata. He now works for Wellington City Council as a principal advisor. Riddhish Parekh has been with Tāhono Media since its inception and also is the spokesperson. He is a firm believer in not only the power of media in shaping public discourse, but also its responsibility in accurately portraying minority communities. He has collaborated with both communities and media in the hope of seeing a media landscape that accurately reflects today's Aotearoa New Zealand. With that, I'd like to pass over to you, Stacey, and thank you for being here.
Kia ora, and thank you for having me. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Stacey Wood, tuku ingoa. And you've already heard my background, so I won't introduce myself any further on that front, but perhaps I can give a bit of background to start off with on why the BSA commissioned this research in the first place. The BSA's core bread and butter work is receiving, investigating and issuing decisions based on complaints about what people see in television or hear on the radio. And its job is to, in making those decisions, is to reflect community standards. And the community that we're talking about there is all people in Aotearoa. But the difficulty we have is if we don't hear from our communities, we don't know what their standards are and what they expect to see on TV and hear on radio. So when we receive complaints, we collect demographic data from the complainants, and consistently that shows that the majority of our complainants are from quite narrow demographics. The majority of them are male, the majority of them are sort of middle-aged, retired or self-employed, Pākehā. So there's a lot of people from various ethnic, religious, other demographic groups that we simply never hear from or very rarely hear from. So determining community standards when you're only hearing from some segments of the community can be difficult, which is why we do research every year to sort of support our knowledge base and make sure that we're hitting the mark. And the research that we did this last financial year was centred on hearing from some of the communities that we don't normally hear from. We went to them rather than waiting for them to come to us when there are clearly reasons why people aren't coming to us for when they see something that's harmful or offensive. So we had to choose certain groups to survey. We're a tiny little Crown entity of 8 people, including myself, and we have a budget of around $1.7 to $2 million, which when you take staff and overheads out of it, doesn't leave much budget for research. So we had to be pretty smart with our budget, and so we chose our groups based on a number of factors, like do they have a broadcasting presence in New Zealand? Are there TV stations or radio stations representing those groups? The size of those populations in New Zealand, and the recommendations of the mosque shooting inquiry. So that was how we landed on Māori, Pacific peoples, Asian New Zealanders, and sort of outlier Muslim New Zealanders group, which is not obviously an ethnicity, but a religious group. But we felt that it was important to hear from that group in light of the recent events in New Zealand. So that was how we decided to do this research. We commissioned an external research agency with expertise to do this for us, because we don't have that expertise in-house. And they went out and they surveyed around 500 people, starting with some focus groups, some small group sessions to understand the issues that to inform the survey questions to make sure that we were going to get the answers that we needed from the research. So small group sessions followed by the quantitative surveys. And the full report's available on our website, so you can peruse all of the various statistics and the methodology as you like, but it had some fairly sobering results, possibly not unexpected given your own research on belonging, which I think this ties in really well with. It sort of touches on a lot of the same sorts of issues of people feeling othered, feeling hurt, feeling like they're not part of the community due to things that they hear said about them or see on television. Some of the key things that came through were that the majority of people from all of these groups had seen something on TV or heard on radio that was harmful or offensive to them within the last 6 months. While social media was by far and away the most common channel to see these things on, mainstream television was also a pretty common response. And some of the examples that were mentioned in the small group sessions that our researchers led with things like Destiny Church encouraging conflict between different groups in the community, stereotypes about Māori and Pacific peoples, for instance, they're all on a benefit. Misinformation, so messages like migrants are coming to take all the jobs, and sensationalizing issues, so like reporting on Māori or Pacific people's spaces at universities. Just going to take a sip of water. And there were, as you would expect, there were a range of opinions between the groups, but also between individual participants about what should be done about this, because it's one thing to identify a problem and it's another kettle of fish to try and solve it, right? So while a majority, so around 3/4, felt that there needed to be moderate or even strong limits in place around some kinds of speech, so discriminatory content, spreading misinformation that reinforces negative stereotypes, hate speech. There were also quite large percentages within each community who felt that people should be able to say whatever you want, and you can simply change the channel or turn off the radio if you don't want to hear it. So there's quite a strong recognition, even while people are feeling hurt and angry and powerless, that freedom of expression is also really important, and that people should be able to express what they're feeling. It's not simply a matter of people saying, I don't like it, so I shouldn't have to hear it. So no sort of clear call to action or silver bullet on how to solve these problems, which I don't think you'll be surprised by, given your comprehensive research on sense of belonging. But I think there are some things we can tackle, and I think it's far more complex than just banning or putting more standards in place. I think there's action to be taken around representation, around how we report the news of the day, and also just, I guess, working together as a wider community so that the news of the day isn't so hurtful often to various communities in Aotearoa. But anyway, that's a whistle-stop tour around the research and the findings. I'll stop there for the moment and look forward to having a bit of a Q&A.
Kia ora, Stacey. Thank you for that. At this time, I think I'll pass on to Riddhish to give a little bit of I guess, an introduction and reaction to this report from a Tāhono Media perspective. Riddhish.
Oh, thanks for that, Koro. And thank you, Stacey, for that. Thank you, Anjum, for the introduction. And I have to acknowledge, Stacey, for the mahi that you've done and just how important this research is. It's almost unfortunate that we weren't surprised when we saw it, because it just kind of reinforced what we've known now for 3 or 4 years since we've since we've been Tāhono Media and since we've started this on mahi of ours. Similar to your research, this is exactly what we've heard from the communities that we reached out to, that they are not being accurately represented, they're underrepresented. And generally the argument is that, but it's factually correct. And we've kept hampering the point that it may be factually correct, but it also needs to be contextually correct. And that context has to be cultural context as well. While Anjum alluded to the Samoa church example, I remember sitting at a news media office and talking about the reporting around monkeypox, and that the entire narrative became that gay men are the only ones responsible for the entire outbreak. Another good example was the reporting around youth offending that picked up last year. And I remember asking them point blank that historically numbers have gone down. So while when you report it day after day, it creates the illusion that youth offending's up. But in reality, that's not what facts are. And even if you're factually correct, that's not what the context is. And interestingly, I think AUTE came out with a research recently that showed a drop in trust in media. And I reckon both of them are interconnected. That when people don't feel like they're being accurately represented, when they don't see themselves on the screen or in the media, there will be a drop in trust. And it's staggering that between 2020 and 2024, there's a 20% drop in trust. And there are risks that when people start losing trust in mainstream media, it opens doors to other unregulated media that masquerade as journalism, and it opens the door to misinformation and disinformation. We've also repeatedly spoken about it is not a one-off that we slipped up once, but when you keep slipping up, it leads to perpetuating narratives that over time inadvertently become fact. An example that I gave was an article which said, Indian doctor makes a mistake. And this was done when the country was going through a crisis and there just weren't enough doctors. And my question was pretty pointed. Do you think that it was important to mention it was an Indian or Pakistani doctor at a time when there aren't enough doctors? Do you want to sow the seeds of doubt in the minds of people that immigrant doctors probably aren't as good? What value did it add to mention the ethnicity of the doctor? While I completely understand that it has to be reported that a doctor's made a mistake, it is the news, but it's about understanding what impact will this have on that community. Are you feeding into narratives and are you perpetuating them? Are you feeding into stereotypes and are you strengthening them? Yeah, thank you.
Kia ora, Riddhish. And yes, it was remiss of me, tēnā koe Anjum, for opening us up tonight and for opening the way. Yeah, he mihi mai aha tēnei kia koutou. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Interesting, this talk about representation, because we're in this time of flux in so many ways, but particularly the media industry, and there's been a condensing of resources, if you like, so the opportunity for representation is even more challenging now. But maybe we can touch on that a little later on, just for people's to let people know we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers a little bit later on. But first, I thought I would open up a discussion between Stacey and Riddhish. I think in terms of, Stacey, from your perspective, we've painted a picture of the situation, of people's experiences with the media. What can the media do to improve things?
Yes, and encouragingly, I've had that question asked from some of our broadcasters, which is great. Like, they want to be doing a good job. And that's reflected in the fact that the authorities only upheld about 5% of the complaints it's received in the last couple of years. But equally, particularly with larger broadcasters, is difficult for them sometimes to get it right when the population they're representing, when they're telling the news, is not represented in their newsrooms. And it was also reflected in the research that the things people were seeing on television and radio that were harmful or offensive to them, people recognised that individually those things were unlikely to breach broadcasting standards one by one, but the cumulative effect of seeing and hearing those things was where the harm was. So a standard system is not the right tool for fighting this, but some of the things that I suggested when broadcasters have asked us about this are things like increasing representation in the newsroom, thinking about framing, so going to that contextualization issue when you're telling a story, even if it is the news of the day, whose voices are you including, whose voices are not in the story, and how are you presenting the story, and it's that sensationalization, the stereotypes, choosing which facts you put at the top of the story, as Riddhish mentioned earlier. And also with social media being identified as such a strong prevalence for this harmful content, broadcasters need to be really mindful of how they're curating their social media channels, because they may put up a pretty straight down the line story, but if it gets loose on YouTube or Facebook or anywhere else, and the wrong crowd comes along and leaves a string of comments underneath it, then anyone who's watching it on that channel is also going to be faced with all of this toxic commentary. And like the likes of the Herald do a pretty good job of curating the comments on their stories that they know are going to be controversial and shutting them down. But it's hard for them to be everywhere all at once. What are some of the other suggestions I gave? A reminder to just be aware and consider the effects of the stories that they're publishing. They've got to strike a balance between getting clicks and getting views, but also not causing harm.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing up that social media space, Stacey, because I know it's a tough one to in terms of moderation. Can you just give us a picture about what the BSA's ability to move into that space, given that it's kind of one of the big vulnerable spaces for our communities?
So we're pretty hamstrung. Our jurisdiction is it's prescribed by the Act, and it's limited to linear television and radio. So we can't even take a complaint about content that's on a media website unless it's previously been broadcast on TV or radio. So we have been calling for regulatory reform for around about 15 years now, and keep getting promised, it's just around the corner, it's just around the corner. But we would at the very least like to see a more platform neutral approach to regulation, so that the online players are treated the same as the mainstream. Social media is a different beast altogether. I think we're looking at platforms where things are mostly user generated, different kind of regulation and moderation, and a lot of that has to come from the platforms themselves. They've got the tools, they just need to be encouraged to use them. And it's not the kind of thing that an individual complaints-based regulatory system can really address.
Thanks, Stacey, for that clarification. I guess Stacey did talk to how the media could improve things now that this report's out, and these issues have been brought to the surface again. Riddhish, from your perspective, what part or what role can community members play in this?
Before I go to that bit, I just want to make a quick point, is that it's interesting, Stacey, you mentioned that, they do it for the clicks and the eyeballs, but I think what your report shows is that they're also losing eyeballs and clicks. That while the argument initially was that we're just giving what the people want, clearly that's not true because this is not what they want.
That's absolutely right. And there was some new research out of, it was a joint bit of research between Otago University and some others that came out just this week or last around news avoidance, which is showing a lot of people switching away from news for a complex set of reasons. But yeah, that ties into what you're talking about.
And now, Koro, to your question, I think there's plenty that communities can do. And I think the first thing that I'd say is that use platforms like the BSA because we know that there have been complaints even for using Koro on the news. So the bar's pretty low, given your formal complaints. If you think that you were not accurately represented, if you think that the reporting hasn't been up to the standard that you expect it to be, report it, regardless of what you think the outcome will be, because as Stacey said, that helps in gathering the information and making more informed decisions on what community standards should be or what they should look like. The second point I'd make is that there has to be more active engagement with the media itself. And I want to extend an olive branch to the media in this, that probably they don't know who to reach out to. And there is a bit of ignorance and a bit of we don't know who to talk to. So probably there is a space for communities to reach out proactively and build those relationships. And a good start would be to reach out to your local media. That if you think that the big organizations are too hard to reach out to, probably your local media, and make those connections. And the first push would be to promote positive stories that happen within your community. Because what we see, it's especially for marginalized communities, are positive stories. They are either victims or perpetrators. There's nothing in between. So we also need those success stories. We also need the slice of life stories from them, because that's the bit that's missing from mainstream media. The third point I'd make is that they need to be more actively media trained. Now, what that looks like could be reaching out to organizations like ours or like-minded organizations on just learning how to deal with media. And why I say this is because not all media is the same, and they cannot just ignore media that don't agree with them or what they'd consider hostile media. Hostile or not, they'd still have to engage with them. And so a bit of training on how do you deal with hostility, how do you deal with unsavory questioning would go a long way. Because in the end, the alternative is just being in this perpetual state of angst and just cut yourself off from the media. But the problem is that the vacuum that they leave is being filled by agents that they probably don't want to see in the first place.
Yeah, thanks for that, Riddhish. We did, or it has been touched on, that whole social media aspect, and another area that this report illuminated was around whether New Zealand, with Aotearoa, had the right balance between freedom of expression and potential harm. I think a majority of respondents felt that the freedom of expression, there needed to be some kind of way to temper that in terms of respecting communities, respecting the views of others. I guess, and this is from both of your perspectives, how do we navigate this difficult area between what's been deemed hate speech or harmful content and freedom of expression?
Yeah, like it's the wicked question that's made it so hard to achieve any kind of regulatory reform, I think, because and we get accused by the likes of the Free Speech Union of wanting to be censors and ban speech and all sorts, whereas we're quite aware that that's not, you can't win hearts and minds by shutting people down. And while there needs to be some limits for genuine hate speech and objectionable content, which the chief censor has powers to take action on, we don't think that lowering the standards or whacking people over the back of their hands is the way to do it. But I think it's true that there needs to be some kind of change in how we talk about media that's harmful, because people say, oh, what's harm? Is it just people being offended? People need to harden up. People need to just whatever. That's not the answer either, right? So I'm starting to ramble now because there is no easy answer. What we'd like to see, though, is a leveling of the playing field so that there is some oversight of online news and reporting as well as mainstream media. Currently, mainstream media, they want to be doing a good job, at least. That's half the battle. Whereas there's a lot of online players who are just in the Wild West. I'd like to see a leveling of the playing field. And then I think we just, the action needs to happen at a community level so that the news of the day isn't able to be sensationalized in a way that is harming different groups in the community, so that the news of the day itself is actually a bit more positive. And maybe that's a bit Pollyanna of me, but that's where I'd like us to see us heading.
Namahi, Stacey. Riddhish, did you have any thoughts in that space around how this is navigated? It is so challenging.
It's interesting, Stacey, when you said that when you point out something that the media does wrong, there's immediately a backlash that, oh, this is censorship and you are trampling on the freedom of expression. And in the same breath, saying Aotearoa, and you'd have 50 complaints and we've already set fire to the freedom of expression. So I think the first point I'd make is that the only bar for standards for reporting cannot be hate speech. While I understand the law and while I understand legislation, from an industry perspective, from a societal perspective, from a moral perspective, hate speech can't be the only bar. There have to be other bars and other sensibilities on what reporting does and has the ability to do within society. And I agree with you that there is a higher bar on mainstream media to regulate themselves because it is the Wild West when it comes to the online players. But the problem is that if mainstream media doesn't, then people would start flocking to these alternative media platforms that have absolutely no obligation to the truth. Leave alone standards, they have no obligation to the truth. And that leaves us in a dangerous territory.
I totally agree. And mis and disinformation is something that really freaks me out. Just the speed at which it's proliferated and the number of people who slip down rabbit holes and there's a lot of research out now that shows that once people go down one conspiracy theory rabbit hole, it's so easy to pick them up and drag them into another one. And it's causing huge amounts of harm. So I agree there needs to be regulation. I think the conversation needs to be more nuanced and it's either total free speech or we're banning stuff. But yeah, it's how you balance that. And you made a great point about the people who are alleged proponents of free speech are all for freedom of expression until you start saying stuff that they don't like.
Yeah. And the last point I'd make is that while, of course, freedom of expression, but now I think it begs the question, at what cost? Because until you had the eyeballs, you had the views, I understand there was an economic logic to it. Clearly not. So then it begs the question that freedom of expression at what cost? Because it's tearing apart society. It's affecting social cohesion. It's clearly not helping your budgets or your accounts. Then freedom of expression at what cost?
And I think the other thing that I've talked about a bit in relation to this research is that freedom of expression isn't just the right to say what you want, it's the right to receive the information that you want. And when we've got a environment where people from various communities are less willing to speak out and be heard, then we're actually losing a lot of voices that people may want to hear from. So it's having a negative effect on our net freedom of expression if the environment is such that people are just not wanting to express themselves.
Yeah, and honestly, for me, it's a PSA to the media that reach out to these marginalized communities, because in the end, they are audiences. If not for anything else, these are eyeballs and views that want to come to you, but you just need to understand that they're also a community who probably have different standards and different expectations. And there is an economic imperative in doing better.
Yeah, thank you both for your thoughts. I noticed that there's a few questions in coming through in Q&A, but I guess just to wrap up this segment before we move on to participants' questions, you've touched on it a little bit, Stacey, in terms of potential regulatory movement, but in an ideal world, now that this information has been brought together in the form of this report, what would you hope can be done with this information? How is this report a tool for improvement? What would you like to see from here?
So within our current legal jurisdiction, until we see regulatory reform, we'll be using this report to inform the authority's decisions. So our authority is a board of 4 members who consider and decide on complaints, and they often refer to our research when they're reflecting on community standards from a particular perspective, because obviously our board can't be representative of all communities in New Zealand. So it will inform that. It'll potentially lead to further research, taking it forward from just identifying the problem to digging a little bit deeper into what can be done about it. We are planning to do some research on that trust in media question. So it may be that we take a particular angle of, what can be done to improve trust in media from some of the perspectives that you've talked about, Riddhish. So we'll be using it within the system that we've got, but also when if and when government decides to consult on regulatory reform, it can also help to inform our submissions on where the law should head.
Riddhish, did you have any thoughts on how this report could be used or could be viewed?
I think it could be a great start in having this conversation in the first place, that you cannot now sweep this under the rug, that this isn't just a few woke people talking. This is now research. These are real people who have had real impacts within their community. And you cannot just, as I said, brushed under the carpet, because it's just not okay anymore. So it could be the starting point of a Koro, that if we don't deal with this now, it's only going to get worse. And I'm glad, Stacey, that I think that you're working on the trust in media, because it does have implications for democracy itself. We cannot have a populace that does not trust its media, because that could have dangerous implications.
Agreed.
Thanks for that, Riddhish. Thank you both for your thoughts, and I will turn my attention now to some of the questions that have come through from participants that have been willing to spend their evening with us. I guess this first one is around, how does the BSA ensure that double standards aren't applied when it comes to media? For example, an example given here from a community member is if an Asian female minor was attacked or a victim and their face was shown in photos compared to potentially another community member, how is there this filter or mechanism that the BSA looks into these so to make sure that double standards aren't applied?
Yeah, that's a good question and a nuanced question. So part of the So the regulatory system at the moment is based on complaints, right? The BSA doesn't have proactive powers to investigate complaints. So we rely on people coming to us, and we're limited by the scope of their complaint. So in the example that's been provided, it would need to be a complaint under probably the discrimination and denigration standard, or the offensive content standard, or potentially the privacy standard. But it would need to identify that discriminatory or racist element in order for the authority to consider it. Where discrimination or other cultural factors are identified in a complaint, the authority will quite often call and co-opt an additional member for that particular complaint who is from the particular cultural group or has expertise to be able to assist in providing that perspective that the board lacks. So that's how we would go about dealing with it. But first, it has to come to us in the first place, which is often the hurdle. Oh, you're on mute.
Thanks for that. Appreciate it. Most of these questions, I believe, will probably be directed at Stacey, but just so you're not feeling left out, Riddhish, there is a question for both of you. It's to hear the panelists' views on the differences between disinformation, stigmatizing a whole group, reporting unnecessary details to build those negative stereotypes, and inflammatory news. More speaking to the different ways that these scenarios are handled, because obviously harmful speech is often oversimplified. There are nuanced ways and different facets to it.
Yeah, it's a huge it is a huge topic. I guess disinformation is specifically false information. Or I mean, it can be true information that's shared for nefarious purposes. It's a kind of a nuanced term in itself, but typically we think of disinformation as being untrue information, whereas content that stigmatizes a group or reporting unnecessary details with negative stereotypes, that's where you're getting into your perhaps either your factual but contextually inaccurate content, or reporting on someone who fits into a negative stereotype, but making it seem like that stereotype is true for all members of that community. In inflammatory news, that's where I talk about the problem being that a lot of the news of the day is simply harmful in itself. Like in the survey responses, not only Māori, but Pacific peoples and Asian New Zealanders all identified anti-Māori content as being one of the examples that they'd seen most prevalently, and that just kind of is a fact of the current political and current affairs cycle, which is really unfortunate. So it's a mix of false information, which can be complained about to us under the accuracy standard, or others if it's appropriate. But media have a responsibility to avoid material inaccuracies in their reporting. Where it comes to stigmatizing or negative stereotypes, that's where our discrimination and denigration standard comes into play. And then where it's reporting unnecessary details or inflammatory news, often those are the ones that come to us and the authority thinks, yeah, that sucks, but it doesn't breach a standard.
Thanks for that, Stacey. Great answer. I'm not sure, Riddhish, if you had any thoughts to add to that.
I mean, I did not know that the BSA did not have suo motu authority. That's interesting, which means that if someone does not complain, you cannot act on it.
Yeah,
that's not lack of initiative. That's just it's just the law.
Yeah.
It's a heavy question on how you deal with these things, but it's a tough one. Disinformation, again, I wouldn't go as so far as to say that the mainstream media indulges in disinformation or misinformation. I don't think I can accuse them of that, and to be fair to them. But I do think that there is unnecessary details, but then unnecessary for whom, because they do solve a purpose. There is the perpetuation of stereotypes. So there is the inclination to get more views because you know that this word will get me more views. So it's not unnecessary, but I mean unnecessary for whom? And harmful content, I think we alluded to this before, that while it used to get you views, it's clearly not anymore. So I think the answer does lie in how do I reduce harm, or first, how do I identify harm? And who do I talk to while I'm identifying harm? And then working with communities to ensuring that there is harm minimization.
Thanks, Riddhish. Here's another question, surprise, surprise for you, Stacey. It's and I'm not sure how much details how it works, but there's an ask here for maybe some concrete examples of complaints that the BSA has worked on, and I guess come to some resolution of sorts. Do you have any examples there?
Yeah, so one that comes to mind is the authority considered a complaint about a radio piece by Kate Hawkesby where she was discussing the removal of the ethnicity adjuster score within the health system, which was a multi-factored way of assessing patients for priority for treatment. And the way that this was discussed on the radio, including reading out text messages from audience, led to the strong implication that Māori and Pacific peoples were being unfairly bumped to the top of the list. There was nothing that you would probably describe, or that a lot of Pākehā would probably describe as overtly racist in the article, but the overwhelming message that was sent was that Māori and Pacific peoples were getting special treatment that they didn't deserve. And so there was a lot of discussion within the authority about this. But the fact that, explicit racist comments were not made didn't take away from the fact that it created an overall discriminatory impression. And so that decision, as well as all of the authorities' other decisions, can be found on our website. We have a pretty good keyword search function there. You can also search for phrases if you use quote marks. So it is worth reading some of the decisions to get a feel for how the authority tackles those complaints. So they always start from the perspective that freedom of expression is the priority, and then it's the question of is there a breach, and is that breach sufficient? Is there enough potential harm to justify an intervention that limits freedom of expression?
Just kind of riffing off the back of that, Stacey, there is some queries about what happens when a complaint is received, and in terms of, I guess, what education is the party that's been complained about given to improve the situation for the future? Yeah, what happens in terms of that, or is there anything that's given for future mitigation?
Yeah, so in terms of penalties, we don't have big teeth. We've got a maximum fine of $5,000. In extreme situations, the authority can order a broadcaster not to advertise for up to 24 hours or not to broadcast for up to 24 hours. But I think that power has only been exercised once or twice in the entire 35-year history, and not within the last sort of 5 to 10 years. Usually, even if a complaint's upheld, the penalty includes a broadcast statement. So the broadcaster has to issue a statement summarising the complaint and the fact that it's been upheld at a similar time to when the original broadcast aired, so that the same audience hears that. And sometimes there's a costs award as well. But really, we rely on the fact that mainstream media do generally have a code of ethics. They do want to be doing a good job. They don't want to be deliberately alienating their audiences. So the mere fact of an uphold is taken quite seriously by most broadcasters, and it's something they want to avoid. And the authority in writing its decision does try to articulate quite clearly the reasons for the uphold and what the broadcaster could have done differently without straying into telling them how to do their job, because that's not what we want to do.
Thanks, Stacey, for that. Now, this is a question that I might throw to you, Riddhish, first, because I'm not sure how much Stacey can weigh into this, but obviously you're welcome, free to. It's just seeking the panel's views on the recent story about hospital staff speaking in foreign languages and the appropriateness of that, and whether that coverage has been balanced. In your view, Riddhish, have you know the story that's been cited?
Before I answer that, and thank you, Stacey, for that example, because I think a recent example was also the Hobson Pledge ad that was shown. And it's the same level of misinformation when it comes to customary rights. And of course, one can't say that it's overtly racist, but there are racial undertones. And I'm glad to hear that that is also considered when you file a complaint, that it need not be overtly racist, but there can be racial undertones. And that is enough for you to consider a complaint. And I have to be honest with you, Koro, that regarding the hospital, at least the articles that I've read did seem balanced. And I think this issue is not a mere reporting issue, but it's a bigger political question. But if you ask me, I reckon that the reporting has been factual, unless there is something that I haven't seen, but at least the things that I have seen, I don't recall seeing something that was problematic, but I could be wrong, and I apologize if I am.
Yeah, Stacey, I'm not sure if are you able to speak to that at all? Or?
Look, I would have to preface it by saying that I'm not a decision maker for the authority, and I think the majority of the reporting on this has been in print, online media anyway. But where it goes, where there is balance provided, like multiple perspectives on an issue, often that's sufficient to remove any accusation of discrimination. But a complaint would have to be made about a particular broadcast, and we would have to consider that to form an opinion. But it might be one of those cases where, as Riddhish says, it's the political and sort of societal issue that's the bigger problem there than the reporting on it.
Yeah, because I do remember reading the first article that I read, it did seem as if nurses were just talking to every patient in their native tongue, regardless of if the patient understood or not. But then I think there are some articles that I read which were balanced, that did explain the context. So as I said, I haven't come across a problematic article, but I could be wrong.
Sure. Thank you for that, both. There's another question, and this speaks to Riddhish, what you mentioned earlier about the community, what they can do to help improve things potentially. There's a question about, would there be a place for, or a space or a role for community groups to be issuing their own media releases and photos to media to help them out, particularly in this, I guess, environment of low resource?
I reckon the answer to that is to building relationships with local media. I reckon probably going straight to a Herald or a Stuff might not be feasible, but going to your local newspapers, local radio stations might be a good first step. And in all honesty, even reaching out to groups like ours could be a good first step. And even exploring options and exploring ideas and exploring initiatives if you feel like, I don't know where to start. And I welcome any community group that wants to reach out to us as step one.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Riddhish. There's a question here about online comments, and I guess this, to your point, Stacey, when broadcasters move their stories to online platforms, and then suddenly the comment section's full of all sorts of comments. The question is, how are decisions made about whether to leave comment sections open or closed? I guess it's a tough one to answer for you both, but that's the question that's being asked, and whether that is something that can be looked at maybe.
Yeah, I have talked to a couple of media about this in the past, and my understanding is a lot of the time it comes down to resourcing. So moderating comments is a huge job. It takes a lot of time and attention, and if you get it wrong, it can be disastrous. So often, if media simply don't have the people on the ground to be moderating comments when a story goes up, they will just turn comments off to start off with. Other times, if a story is kind of borderline, I've seen them open up comments, but issue a warning, keep it civil, or we're turning them off, be good. Or if things get out of control, they'll just delete and close down comments after leaving them open to start off with. So, but it's often just a question of who's got the time and energy to actually be fielding them and keeping it cleaned up.
Yeah, I guess I can maybe just speak in terms of because Wellington City Council, people may or may not know that hugely.
You guys do a great job with the social media.
Yeah, so there's it gets to the point, I guess, where if there's harm being perpetuated, so we have good resources in terms of being able to moderate, and the concept is to go back and forth to get to a place where we might not necessarily agree, but we'll just be comfortable with each other's positions. But if it starts to venture into like harmful speech, or where a third party or other eyes are seeing stuff, then that's when the comments kind of taken offline, if that makes sense. I understand time is it's getting to that time, so I thank you both for your thoughts. There's a couple of quick questions I just wanted to touch on here, because one, and it might be a good way to wrap up, Stacey, in terms of, there's a question here about how can the BSA make the complaint, or is the BSA even looking at this, making the complaint process simpler and easier, because it does seem to be on the onus of complainants to come to you to trigger action. So are you looking at that, or how can
Yeah, absolutely, we're looking at that. We've already been putting together and releasing some simple video resources for people to use to quickly understand how our complaints process works. We're also reminding broadcasters of their obligations to broadcast ads notifying people that the BSA exists and that they can complain. And we're also just talking to people, so the likes of yourselves and other community representative groups, to, I guess, make ourselves a little bit more approachable and human, and not just a faceless government organisation. So we're working on it, but welcome any suggestions.
Thanks.
Just quickly, Koro, if there's any questions that we can't answer, they could send an email to us, and we are happy to answer them.
Yeah, I just want to get to one last question. I know I'm pushing it, but because this attendee hasn't asked before, so I wanted to make sure they're being heard, and it's basically around the whole format of reality shows. Now, there's lots of reality shows which have different communities represented, where it's, I think there's one called Four Goes Flatting, and a restaurant that makes mistakes about people with dementia. Does the BSA look at those types of programs in terms of the potential for them undermining communities?
Again, only if we receive a complaint, and we can sometimes look at programs in a series if people complain about an entire series, but it's got to be within the 20 working day time limit, which can be challenging. And then it would go to that question of, is it discriminatory? Is it offensive? Is it unfair to people. So there is a fairness standard, and that goes to the people that are involved in the broadcast. Are they being treated with fairness? So if people, for example, were invited to appear on a show but not told how they were going to be portrayed or what the focus of the show was going to be, it'll be considered to be unfair. So it's all about telling people how they're going to be shown.
Thanks so much, Stacey, for that. Well, as I mentioned, time's coming to a close, but before I hand it to Anjum to skillfully tie things up, I maybe just Stacey and Riddhish, if you had any last words in terms of maybe last thoughts or key things you'd like to attendees to take with them when they leave this evening.
Stacey, go first.
Sure. No, I think the questions have been really great. So thank you to the people attending for asking those. And please keep the conversation going. You know, this isn't supposed to be a one and done kind of piece of research. So do stay in touch, email us, contact us if you want to know more. And thank you for organising this.
Riddhish, yeah.
And likewise, I completely understand that it seems like a daunting task, both for, I think, communities and the media on not knowing where to start. I think more communities than media, but I think Tāhono Media does welcome you to reach out to us as a first step. And we could look at opportunities, explore ideas and ways that we can bridge this gap that exists between communities and the media. And yeah, thank you everyone for attending.
Koro, I appreciate that. And you just like Tāhono Media is on LinkedIn. You can Google us. And yeah, sorry, you'll see in the chat there's some directions there. And just to let you know, there are other people that are a part of this this rōpū. It's not just Riddhish and myself, but they're a bit shy this evening, we'll say. But on that note, I'll hand over to Anjum to wrap things and tie things up for us. Appreciate you both.
Well, thank you. Awesome work, everyone. That has been an absolutely riveting session and some really crucial topics that we've talked about. So you will see in the chat all the various links. I would also say this webinar is being recorded and we'll have it available online. So please do share it through your network so that a whole range of communities can get this information and hear what we've talked about today. We also have a report coming out in coming weeks, which highlights the lack of research being done around media representation for particular communities, and which has some really interesting findings. And this is the literature review that was done with the support of the University of Auckland and University of Waikato, Varitza Rupa and Dr. Parekh. So please look out for that on our social media. And we also have some other resources that are in the pipeline, as well as the potential of a community and media event planned for 2025. So if you want to hear about those things, once again, please do follow us on LinkedIn to keep up to date. I just want to now finish us off with a closing karakia. Kua mutu o mātou mahi, mō tēnei wā, mana kitia mai tātou katoa, o mātou hoa, o mātou whānau, ai o ki te aorangi, tihei Māori ora. And the translation is, our work has finished for the time being, protect us all, our friends, our family, peace to the universe. Thank you.
Kia ora.
Kia ora, pomari e koutou.